Okay. Well, thanks very much, Nick, and thanks to you and to Paul and Roger for the invitation to participate in the symposium. I'm speaking this morning from Adelaide on the traditional land of the Gaurnaut people. I acknowledge their cultural background, their living heritage, and pay my respects to Gaurnaut elders past, present and emerging. My presentation focuses on a plan prepared in 1917 and promoted as offering preliminary tentative ideas for the future development of Adelaide and its suburbs. Although introductory and provisional in terms of its detail, and although carrying the qualification that it would require elaboration if it were to be considered for implementation, theoretically, the plan was firmly grounded in the Garden City idea. It was developed to show how the principles of planning on Garden City lines could be applied at metropolitan scale. Whilst the plan was not realised as a whole, discrete elements of it did come to pass. The author of the Adelaide and Suburbs Plan was Charles Reade. Sorry, I'm just not getting my slides to move. Okay. Charles Reade, New Zealand-born journalist turned town planner and a significant person in the history of the Garden City movement in Australia and elsewhere. Reade came to Australia originally for the Australasian Town Planning Tour of 1914-15 to deliver lectures promoting town planning and Ebenezer Howard's Garden City idea on behalf of the London-based Garden Cities and Town Planning Association. When the tour finished, the South Australian government employed him as advisor on town planning and eventually appointed him as the state's inaugural government town planner. In October 1917, along with Victor Ryan, director of the South Australian Tourist and Intelligence Bureau, Reade organised the first Australian Town Planning and Housing Conference and exhibition. The Adelaide and Suburbs Plan was prepared for that event. So before introducing the plan and its theoretical basis, I'll give a brief background about Adelaide's planning and development to 1914 when Reade arrived, and follow that with an overview of the Adelaide and Suburbs Plan and its theoretical basis. Then I'll speak about responses to the plan and elements that were adopted and suggest reasons why the plan was not realised before making some closing remarks. South Australia was proclaimed as a colony of Britain in December 1836, after which the site for the capital city, later named Adelaide, was selected and surveyed, and the plan of Adelaide was finalised. The plan was textbook for its time and is a renowned example of the grand model of colonial planning. This city was laid out in two parts, divided by a river, and featured wide gridded streets, squares, and an encircling ring of parklands. Although the underpinning structure was retained, before long, modifications were made to the plan. For example, within the first years of land sales, landowners subdivided the regularised town acres into smaller land parcels of various shapes. The number of east, west and north, south streets was increased, and laneways and alleyways were inserted. In the early years, most people settled in the city itself, but it was not long before some moved to the periphery, lured by cheaper land available in the villages that emerged beyond the parklands and later formed the nucleus of the early suburbs. Unlike the carefully planned capital, the villages were unplanned. As in the capital, though, development occurred in them on a laissez-faire basis. Sites were allocated primarily for streets and houses and rarely for open space. It was not until 1911, more than 7 decades after European settlement, that South Australia's first Building Act was passed. However, the Act proved largely ineffectual. So with state government support, in 1913, representatives of local government bodies formed a committee to develop a town planning bill for South Australia. They aimed to put it before Parliament in 1914. By 1914, when Reade arrived in Adelaide to begin the Australasian Town Planning Tour, the town planning bill was still in preparation. Additionally, awareness and concern was heightened at that time amongst individuals, community and professional groups, local government bodies and members of parliament about the detrimental effects of uncontrolled development on Adelaide and its environs and on the general health of the population. The effects were evident in the physical condition of parts of the city, particularly in the West End, which from the outset of settlement had been the mixed-use part of town. The West End was characterised by cheek-by-jowl development, including houses and factories side by side, substandard housing, inadequate sanitation, and a lack of places for children to play. However, some pockets of the city did not suffer these problems, as they were away from the areas where industries operated and had ready access to the parklands and to the city squares and gardens. The well-heeled lived mainly in these places. Generally then, circumstances in Adelaide and South Australia more broadly were ripe for Reade to promote the concept and benefits of town planning, as well as the Garden City vision, objectives and planning approach. He did this at first through his town planning lectures. One of his early achievements as town planning advisor was to convince the South Australian government to purchase land on which to build a model garden suburb, where people could see, walk through and experience for themselves a place planned on Garden City lines. The land was bought in 1915 on the urban fringe at Mitcham, about 6 kilometres south of the city centre. In due course, Reade arranged for a bird's eye perspective of the proposed model suburb to be drawn to his design. It was ready for display at the 1917 Town Planning and Housing Conference, along with his plan of Adelaide and suburbs. The bird's eye perspective for the Mitcham Garden suburb and the plan of Adelaide and suburbs were visual tools that Reade used to promote the key messages of his lectures and later as appropriate opportunities arose. And those messages were the notion of planning as a systematic, coordinated and forward-looking process, the focus and benefits of the Garden City idea, the concept of the garden suburb as a self-contained community, and the method and principles of planning on Garden City lines. Reade's layout for the model garden suburb applied Howard's Garden City idea at residential scale. By contrast, his Adelaide and suburbs plan demonstrated what British architect planner Raymond Unwin termed the larger metropolitan aspects of Howard's idea, as portrayed in his social city model that Rob's already talked about. After Howard, the Adelaide and suburbs plan showed in particular how decentralisation, fully planned, self-contained satellite communities and reserved public land could be used to shape and contain a city and keep it in reasonable proximity to open country. Unwin himself had demonstrated his own interpretation of the application of these aspects in his widely published 1912 diagram, the Garden City Principle applied to suburbs, which Rob's also mentioned too. As Unwin explained, suburbs were constellated, quote, as satellites revolving around the central sun town and separated by open park spaces. In preparing the Adelaide and suburbs plan then, Reade drew on Howard as well as on Unwin. He also referenced the urban containment and open space structural device of the encircling ring of parklands that William Light had applied in the plan of Adelaide. Additionally, he incorporated the concept of the Parkway Boulevard, a reference to parkways that were being used at the time in the United States, quote, to make parks accessible to the people and to connect one park with another. The Adelaide and suburbs plan showed Adelaide's existing structure of a city core contained by parklands. Here we go, in here. And flanked by suburbs and subdivisions extending largely around the centre, but dotted also, these black lines indicate where there's existing development. And then you can see it also along the coast here. And down here around the port at Port Adelaide. So the plan showed where the extent of existing development, and the new features of the plan included designated areas for future residential satellite communities, including the site for the model garden suburb at Mitcham, which is down here. And for other garden suburbs and town planning schemes. And if you look closely, you can see where he's talked, sorry. Sorry, my mouse is very sensitive. You can see where he's marked for other garden suburbs and town planning schemes. He's also referred to it's also mentioned a separate sort of factory area around the port at Port Adelaide with an adjacent model housing area for workers, and that's at the top of the diagram. There's areas for open space within town planning schemes, as well as specific open space elements, and namely an outer ring of parklands combined with a parkway boulevard located on the then Metropolitan fringe. And you can see that represented in the circular form. There's reserved land for public uses on either side of the River Torrens from the foothills to the sea, and that's in the middle. I'm hesitant to put my finger on my mouse again in case I move the slides along. But if you have a look in the middle, you can see the river running through the diagram on an angle. And it extends from the foothills, from the Adelaide foothills through to the sea. And then reserved land along the Metropolitan coastline from Outer Harbour in the north to Merino in the south for foreshore improvements and a marine boulevard. There's also new roads with direct connections within the city and to the suburbs and to the port. There's a major rail link from the city to the docks, warehouses and factories at Port Adelaide. There's new roads between the proposed suburbs. And if you have a look at the diagram about in the middle on the left, you'll see on the coast a new seaside garden suburb and transportation links to that from existing coastal towns and with the city. And they were train and tram lines. So how was the Adelaide and Suburbs plan received? Well, first, the initial responses. Reade's plan captured the direction in which reformers of the Australian city wish to move towards a holistic approach to city planning, and latterly has been recognised as the first, quote, conscious attempt in Australia to plan land use and transport patterns at metropolitan scale. However, it attracted little professional or community attention at the time of the 1917 conference or afterwards, and there was no similar attempt in the 1910s to develop a comprehensive metropolitan plan for another Australian capital city. Reade published the plan in the proceedings of the 1917 conference. He reproduced it and outlined its rationale, features and advantages in his own 1919 report on the planning and development of towns and cities of South Australia. As Rob mentioned, Australian town planning advocate John Sorman mentioned specific aspects of the plan, notably its parkland and open space provisions, and published it in 1921 in Town Planning in Australia. But essentially, that was it in terms of commentary. The South Australian government did not invite Reade to develop the Adelaide and Suburbs plan further, and so it was shelved. However, the government did proceed with one component, and that was the model garden suburb at Mitcham. It was laid out as Reade designed it. The suburb was formally named Permanent Gardens in April 1921, ahead of the inaugural land sales a few months later. Permanent Gardens is celebrating its centenary this year. Later in the century, the Adelaide and Suburbs plan resurfaced in professional planning circles. It directly influenced metropolitan open space planning policy in South Australia in the 1960s and 1990s, early 2000s. As a result, the three specific open space elements of the plan came to fruition. A second generation of parklands, Rather than being an encircling belt, as Reade proposed, they were developed as a linked system of parks and reserves across the metropolitan area. The system is known as MOS, Metropolitan Open Space System. The second was the linear park of reserved land extending along the River Torrens from the foothills to the sea. And the third was what is called Coast Park, which comprises 70 kilometres of continuous reserved land along the metropolitan foreshore. And Reade's 1917 plan was published in 2001 in the Parklands 21 strategy document. So why was the Adelaide and Suburbs plan not realised? Well, I offer a few possible contributing factors. Firstly, the socioeconomic climate. 1917 was the period of the First World War, and the years that followed in South Australia were ones of post-war recovery, severe housing shortages, and financial stringency. The government began building the model garden suburb in 1921, and it was completed by the end of 1927. Its construction was an expensive undertaking, and at the time, the cost factor was noted as one reason for why other garden suburbs were not developed. About the time that the suburb was completed, the economic situation in South Australia was affected considerably by the onset of a severe drought, and not long after that, by the beginning of the Depression that had the entire country, and indeed the world, in its grip by the end of the decade. The second contributing factor is the demise in support for town planning. The initial professional, community and political support for town planning in South Australia waned after its heyday during World War I. Professional bodies and private landowners increasingly spoke out against proposed town planning legislation. It took Reade 4 years to gain sufficient support to put a town planning bill before Parliament, following the failure of the 1916 bill that he drafted. Reade left South Australia in December 1920 on secondment to the Federated Malay States. His departure meant the loss of the state's leading champion for town planning. The government had not moved on his 1917 plan, and it would not do so in his absence. Political will was essential to achieve town planning outcomes. Over time, the will diminished. The Liberal government that had given considerable support to Reade and to town planning was removed in 1924. The 1920 Town Planning and Development Act that Reade had persevered so long to achieve was repealed in 1929, and the town planner's role was relegated essentially to one of approving new subdivisions. A third sort of factor is really around the question of whether Adelaide was ready for a metropolitan plan like Reade proposed, or was the plan ahead of its time? And I think the situations and circumstances that I've just mentioned suggest that the time was not right for a plan like Reade's. Adelaide was relatively small. The population of the metropolitan area when Reade arrived was about 200,000 people. And in the city of Adelaide itself, there are about 40,000 people. However, I think it's interesting the fact that the three open space elements of Reade's plan were introduced later. And perhaps that indicates the relevance, at least of those aspects of the plan. And when the moment was right, they were introduced. So a few concluding remarks. The intrinsic value of the Adelaide and Suburbs plan of 1917 lies in what it tells us about planning ideology, aspirations and approaches of the time. Town planner and Garden City advocate Charles Reade identified a unique opportunity for Adelaide to acknowledge and build on its roots as a systematically planned city by adopting the larger aspects of Howard's Garden City idea to systematically guide the future layout, shape and size of its metropolitan area. A sense of order pervaded Reade's Adelaide and Suburbs scheme, in sharp contrast to what he described as the muddlement that characterised the capital. And there he's referring to the capital at the time that he arrived there, not obviously referring to the plan itself. Taking the long view of Metropolitan Adelaide, Reade considered existing and future land uses and transportation routes, patterns and modes, incorporating them in a cohesive plan. It showed where and how growth would occur beyond the central urban core in self-contained communities intended as discrete residential centres within the metropolitan periphery. He showed too how reserved open space between the communities could serve the dual purposes of preventing developed areas from merging into one undefined mass and of ensuring that people had the opportunity for easy contact with nature. The outer ring of parklands with Parkway Boulevard, the River Torrens Parkway and the coastal boulevard of public reserves not only introduced open space as a structural device, but also reinforced the strongly held contemporary view that nature played a fundamental role in everyday urban life and in keeping cities and their citizens healthy. The model garden suburb of Gaurnaut Gardens, which was built as an exemplar of planning on garden city lines at residential scale, also exemplified what might have been if the other self-contained satellite communities or suburban centres that Reade proposed had eventuated. The suburb did, however, have an influence on planned residential developments built later in metropolitan area. The what if Reade's Adelaide and Suburbs plan was elaborated and adopted is an intriguing question to consider, as is one that ponders whether, by not adopting it, the government of the day indeed squandered a unique opportunity for metropolitan Adelaide.
Thank you, Christine. Thanks again for a great sort of set of visuals as well, and talk that connects strongly, I think, to Robert's talk just now. I've got a couple of comments of my own, but I'll obviously happy to throw it open to others for questions, comments, observations, connections to be made. So yeah, if you want to raise your hand in real time and on the screen or virtually with the reactions function, please do so, or put it in the chat if you prefer that as well. While I'm waiting to see some hands, okay, let me see if this is a question from
David's question.
David, yeah, I just saw the question mark at the very end of it. Thanks, Christine. Reade was a globally aware planning advocate. There was a sense in which he saw his South Australian Adelaide work as best practice model to use anywhere. Was the model garden suburb a model for the rest of Adelaide, or did the vision extend beyond? So there's a couple of questions, I think, in there about the sort of the international aspirations of Reade himself, and whether he saw it travelling beyond Adelaide, I think.
Yeah. Well, Reade himself had come from Britain. He had worked for the Garden Cities and Town Planning Association before he came to Adelaide, or before he came to Australia on the lecture tour. And he was very aware of what was happening internationally. And I think he saw it as his mission, really, to bring those international ideas being applied elsewhere to his work in, first of all, in promoting them through the town planning tour, and then when he worked in South Australia, in endeavouring to apply them. So I think what he was doing was in that 1917 plan, was trying to bring in what he knew about what was happening elsewhere in the world, apply it to the context that he saw in Adelaide, and use it really, or see it as an opportunity for others to learn from other parts of Australia. So the fact that he had it ready for the 1917 conference, which was a significant event, national event, about 250 delegates from around Australia. First time that they had come together for an event like this in Australia, and he took that as an opportunity. He arranged an exhibition that accompanied that, and he brought in material from all parts of the world. So yes, I think he was thinking beyond Adelaide, both in the plan of Adelaide and also in the plan for Gaurnaut Gardens, the model garden suburb. And he certainly saw the model garden suburb as being replicated in South Australia and, sorry, in Adelaide, and also in other parts of Australia.
Okay.
But there were other garden suburbs being built at that time as well. I guess the other thing to say about Reade was that he was a great communicator and networker, and shared information with colleagues and received information from colleagues as well, and did his utmost to try and sort of communicate that to people he worked with.
I mean, maybe just to follow on from that, I mean, I thought one thing that just occurred to me, you know, and you mentioned there just what a great communicator he was, how dynamic he was, and that's the case with several individuals who seek to plan in the urban periphery. I mean, I think we'd mentioned this point about the urban periphery being this sort of physical and literal, or symbolically, apparently opportunistic space to do grand things. And yet we've also heard how difficult it's been to achieve some of those, sometimes maverick, sometimes grand, sometimes idealistic schemes, even when you've got a really charismatic figure involved. Some of it is to do with timing, as you mentioned. I think some of it is to do with there is something there. There's always something there. It's not an empty space. There's always interest existing there, whether it's landed interests, as David and Victoria had mentioned with the metro town the other day. So it's quite interesting. You know, schemes come forward, and sometimes it's to do with timing. Sometimes it's to do with the interest that exists in this apparently, you know, empty space. But there's always a there.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been thinking about in preparing for this presentation is actually to look at the plan, or to look at Adelaide as it is now, Adelaide and Metropolitan Adelaide. And just because there was a lot of planned development that did occur after Reade left and through you know, different decades with various bodies, private and government, as leading that. But to actually see where those planned communities are in relation to what Reade proposed in 1917. So I think it would actually be quite interesting to look at that, and then to look at that in relation to the second generation system of parklands that now exists, and how that sort of worked vis-a-vis what Reade proposed.
Final questions, comments? We've got a couple of minutes if people want to. David?
Can I ask, can I just ask, the most radical part of the plan seemed to me to be the giant ring parkway, which covers a lot of space and takes up a lot of, and goes through a lot of different, and I'm wondering, was that, I mean, in the US, parkways become very important in the 20s and in the teens in the 20s, but they're rarely at that point circular. They tend to go out and take people into spaces. And I was wondering, is that just a love of the circular, or is that something that is prominent in Australian planning theory, or?
Well, I think the ring was an acknowledgement of the use of the encircling ring of parklands in the original plan for Adelaide, and that is a sort of renowned aspect of the Adelaide plan, that encircling ring. The fact that it was proposed, it was implemented, and it actually still exists today. So that was a prominent feature, and there were, before Reade arrived, there were others in Adelaide calling for an outer ring of parklands, and I think he was picking up on on that sort of rhetoric, as well as, in a way, sort of paying his respect to the original plan, because he greatly admired the plan of Adelaide and William Light, who was the author of that plan.